Okay, we're continuing with the book here, Prevent and Reverse Stroke and Heart Attack by me, Pete Rogers. We're on page 77 if you're following along with the book, chapter 3, Diabetes, Gateway Disease number 2. So basically, conventional medicine teaches its young medical students and doctors, first we must do a history and physical exam, and then we must come up with a differential diagnosis. And then we ferret out the differences between the possible causes of the patient's symptoms. And then and only then do we make a tentative preliminary diagnosis and consider therapy. Match the ill to the pill and send the bill. Okay, and that sounds nice, and yes, that's true in a complex situation. But let me tell you something. For the most part, Western patients, the majority of them, when they walk into like an internal medicine doctor's office, most of them have the same problem. Most of them are overweight. Most of them are hypertensive. Most of them are pre-diabetic or diabetic. Most of them have atherosclerosis throughout their bodies, most importantly in the heart, coronary artery disease. So what I'm saying is most of them all have the same disease, and it's the same BS. It's the Western chronic disease of a high-fat diet, okay? And, so the first thing they really need to do is stop eating a high-fat diet. And stop eating all those animal foods. Stop eating all that processed food. Okay, so now we're going to go through diabetes, and I can tell you all the conventional medical textbooks, they're stupid. Conventional medicine is a joke. All the famous medical hospitals, when it comes to chronic disease, they all stink. They're all a disgrace. They're all an embarrassment. They're all evil. You need to know that so you don't be a chump. All right, they don't know anything about nutrition, epidemiology, or toxicology, and that's what causes most disease. So they're like a bunch of clowns, okay? It'd be like, a basketball team that doesn't know how to dribble, okay? A baseball team doesn't know how to pitch and catch. It's a joke, okay? I'll make that very clear here. It'll be very easy to do. All right, so this is a diagram of the stages of diabetes. I just made up these stages based on the information, and it really goes a lot with the ectopic fat theory of Gerald Shulman, and it's basically the same general idea. You start out by accumulating fat in the skeletal muscle, and that's also called intramyocellular lipid. That causes the effect that's known as overnutrition. It causes dysfunction of the intermitochondrial membrane electron transport, so it reverses direction. And the cell senses overnutrition, sends a message to its plasma membrane not to allow any more glucose into the cell. So you get postprandial hyperglycemia. That means high blood glucose after eating when you got high fat in the skeletal muscle. The fat gradually continues to accumulate, starts accumulating more and more in the liver. When you get a fatty liver, then you get inability of the liver to properly sense blood glucose levels. So normally that's the main job of the liver, to sense blood glucose levels and to maintain a normal blood glucose level during fasting for the brain. Initially it's primarily by the breakdown of glycogen, stored carbohydrate, but then it's largely due to the conversion of, for example, amino acids into glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis. Okay, you can have a lot of glycogen burning for about 48 hours approximately, very easily 24 hours. That's why I eat the OMAD diet, one meal every 24 hours, one meal a day, OMAD diet. But you start going into ketosis after about 48 hours or so. Anyways, what I'm getting at here is after you accumulate fat in the liver causing even fasting hyperglycemia, you'll then start accumulating fat in the pancreas. So these are like stages of diabetes. Fat accumulation in the skeletal muscle, fat accumulation in the liver, fat accumulation in the pancreas. Excessive fat accumulation in the pancreas is toxic, causes beta cell dysfunction. The beta cells in the pancreas are the ones that make insulin. So you start getting decreased ability to produce insulin. And once that pancreas totally fails, now you're screwed, and you're going to have to stay on insulin for the rest of your life. You get insulin-dependent diabetes. That's sort of the general progression of steps in diabetes. Okay, and then you get all these secondary complications due to around-the-clock hyperglycemia. All right, so the key point is start minimizing dietary fat so you'll reduce this fat in the liver, reduce this fat in the skeletal muscle. This is just showing the intermitochondrial membrane. It's the center for ATP production. About 90% of the ATP in the human body is produced in the intermitochondrial membrane. ADP, adenosine diphosphate, gets a phosphate added onto it to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphates on there. And it's a process of coupling electron transport down the intermitochondrial membrane with oxidative phosphorylation. So protons are pumped into the intramembranous space, and then through ATP synthase, the proton gradient is harvested to let a proton, H plus is a proton, come back across it. So what you need to know is an excessive amount of fat, especially saturated fat, will inhibit the electron transport chain in the region of coenzyme Q and complex 3. And then, because it can no longer pass electrons down, it'll start to reverse direction. It'll start dropping electrons. That's called, proton. You're going to start dropping your electrons down onto oxygen, producing superoxides, okay, due to electron leak. Not good. Okay, when that's excessive, that can start causing all kinds of free radicals, reactive oxygen species, and destruction. A little bit is normal, and the mitochondria can cope with it quite well, but this is going to cause secondary problems. I'll show you what they are here in a moment. A signal, well, first of all, here's how insulin normally works. Insulin normally binds to the skeletal muscle cell, and then the insulin receptor initiates a cascade of reactions that result in glucose type 4 transporters being sent from the cytoplasm up to the plasma membrane. The glucose channels, they merge with the plasma membrane and they allow glucose to come into the cell. Those are called glucose type 4 transporters, and those are insulin dependent. That's an important point. That's normal insulin function. Okay, now when you've got overnutrition due to excessive amounts of fat, especially saturated fat in the mitochondria, it'll send a signal to the plasma membrane to not allow glucose type 4 transporters to be sent up to the plasma membrane. So if you can't get these glucose type 4 transporters up to the plasma membrane, then you can't get glucose into the cell. This happens right after eating, so this is postprandial hyperglycemia. The fat gets into the skeletal muscle first, faster than the glucose does, and then it blocks the glucose from coming in. So overnutrition due to excessive fat with subsequent blocking of glucose type 4 transporters going to the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle. Glucose can't get into the cell. This just happened after eating, so it's postprandial hyperglycemia. Okay, this is the concept of glucose tolerance. Basically, if you eat the fat first, or the fat with the starch, it's going to cause insulin resistance. So this is the blood glucose level. The blood glucose, if you ate the starch alone, it'll bump up a little bit. That's normal. It's supposed to do that. But if you eat the fat first or simultaneously with it, it's going to cause insulin resistance, and now your blood glucose is going to spike a lot higher. So the problem is the fat causing insulin resistance. Resistance to insulin function. Okay, and then here's what messes everything up. The fat is able to flip into the skeletal muscle cell more rapidly than the glucose can get into the skeletal muscle cell. So it can, it's a carboxylic acid, and it can get protonated and intercalate itself into the outer leaflet of the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle, and then it can flip-flop into the inner leaflet of the plasma membrane and then move into the cytoplasm. So fat can get into the skeletal muscle very quickly, and that enables it to, in a sense, take over the skeletal muscle. So now you'll accumulate intramyocellular lipid. And they tried to block this with all kinds of different protein blockers like the CD36 fatty acid transporter. It didn't matter. It was just a bulk movement of fat across that plasma membrane. So you can't stop it with an inhibitory drug. It's simply proportional to the amount of fat the person eats. Okay, so you don't want to do that. You want to minimize your dietary fat. Okay, so you're not going to win that game other than by minimizing your dietary fat. The guy who figured this out, one of the main guys, is Michael Brownlee. He had type 1 diabetes himself. He was trying to save his own life. He wrote the best paper ever written about dialysis, about diabetes, called The Pathobiology of Diabetic Complications, a Unifying Mechanism. It was published in the Diabetes Journal in June of 2005. So if you want to see a great paper, look up the Banting Award winner in 2004, Michael Brownlee. Okay, that's all we're going to cover for today. I hope you found that helpful. So that's a very important thing. The number one most important cause of insulin resistance is accumulated dietary fat, especially saturated fat. That's a big deal. So what does that mean? If you want to improve your insulin sensitivity, you want to minimize saturated fat and fat in general.